Hello and welcome to episode number 8. Our last episode, we talked about the Old Testament and God's discipline and how to deal with all of that and still have the view that God is a servant, because you have to get obstacles out of your way to see God correctly. And I certainly had to do that with regard to the Old Testament. But once you get past the obstacles and you realize that God, as the greatest being of all, is therefore the greatest servant of all, once you get to that point, then you start thinking, okay, if I imitate God and really become the servant I need to be, whether you are naturally that or not, that's what you want to be, then there are many fruits of servanthood. And I want to share about 4 of those with you, one today, and then the episodes thereafter, the other 3. The abundant life is the one I want to talk about now. In John 10, Jesus said, verse 10, that he came to give us an abundant life. He came to give us life to the full, depending on the version that you are reading. And so that's what he wants to bless us with. He wants to serve us by giving us an abundant life. But then you turn to passages like Luke 9 and Luke 14, and it talks about self-denial and hating your family and bearing the cross daily and giving up your life and all of that. And you say, wow, from a worldly vantage point, you read those things and you think, I don't believe, not today. That's not the bus I want to get on, because we have a worldly perspective of it. But if God is a servant and wants to bless us, wants to serve us by blessing us with an abundant life, you've got to get a spiritual perspective, his perspective on what all of those things will do in your life. For example, let's talk about the self. You know, we have a selfish self, and then we have a self made in the image of God, and you've got to decide which one is going to dominate. Is selfishness going to dominate, or self-denial? Counting others better than self, serving others like God serves us. Which one are you going to do? And I was blessed with real-life examples in my 2 grandmothers. One of my grandmothers was pretty self-focused. It was all about her and what pleased her and what hurt her and all of that. And so I saw that kind of grandmother. And then I had another grandmother that was a servant par excellence. I mean, she was always serving. She was amazing. She was a giver beyond a giver. They lived in a 2-bedroom house. 1-bath, 2-bedroom house. That was what my dad was raised in. And yet my grandmother would take anyone in. She had more sons than 4, because she would take other sons in that needed a place to live, and they would live there. It was amazing how many lives she touched that way. She would have a relative move in, take the bedroom, take the boy that was living in the bedroom or the boys in the bedroom, put them in the dining room or the living room or some other room, but that was just her. I never saw her depressed. I never saw her down. I never heard her gossip. I never heard her say a bad word about anyone. It was amazing. I never saw her unhappy. And you might be inclined to think, well, she faked it pretty well then, right? I think most of us are pessimistic enough to think that way. But I'm telling you, I was around her a lot. I chose to be around her a lot. She was amazing. She was a servant. She got up every morning and cooked this huge breakfast. And we're talking about out in the country. We're talking 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. But I got to see in 2 grandmothers what self-denial or self-indulgence or self-focus did. And so when God asks us to deny self, that's not a negative. That's a tremendous positive, because then we're able to give and be a giver like him. And when we're a giver like him, we are blessed. And then I think about the idea of cross bearing. Bearing your cross. Now, I know at times that's a really heavy deal. It involved in the New Testament church and in places today, persecution. And I've been through some of that, and I know it doesn't feel good in one way, but if you get a different perspective on it, it actually is very gratifying, oddly so. Jesus said, when you're persecuted for me, jump for joy. And there are times that I felt like doing that. I thought, wow, I'm willing to pay the price. I feel better about me. I'm willing to deny self. I'm willing to take up a cross. But at any rate, when you get to the cross thing, here is something Jesus said about following him and bearing a cross. He talks about it in terms of having a yoke. But in Matthew 11, beginning in verse 28, here's what he said about himself and about us following him. I love this passage. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Isn't that a beautiful passage? His yoke is easy, his burden is light, compared to what it's going to be if we don't deny self and take up his cross. And so he tells us this is a part of the abundant life that I'm giving you. And there are other passages that relate. I love the one in Galatians 2 and verse 20. He says there, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. You know, when you really allow God to take over your life, you allow him, as one sister said one time, she said, I wasn't really looking for God, but God invaded me. That was a beautiful way to say it. She was a beautiful soul. She bought in 100% to God's way, and she was a breath of fresh air. But she said God invaded her. And so I pray God invades all of us, because there are times when I have let God into my life so deeply that I actually have done things that shocked me. I didn't know I could do it, but I did it. And sometimes when I was doing those things, it was like I was a third person. I was somewhere else watching me do it, thinking, how is that possible? How can a guy like me do that? And yet I was doing it. When we're crucified with Christ, and it's no longer about us, but it's him living in us and with us and through us, then life takes on an entirely different perspective. And so being crucified with Christ, taking up a cross, seems to be a negative thing, but it really isn't. It's actually a very positive thing. When you know that you love God enough to take up a cross and endure whatever the world brings your way. He said, in me, you have peace. In the world, you're going to have trouble. But when we're having trouble in the world because of him, then there is a peace that passes understanding that we get from him. It's amazing how all of this works. It doesn't make sense until you do it. There's a lot of this from an intellectual discussion, philosophical standpoint that does not make sense. But when you actually do it, it works. And so the idea of self-denial and cross-bearing and dying to self, all of that really does work. God is a giver. And everything about God is, I'm a servant, therefore I'm a giver. That's what I do. I give. I give to you, I bless you, I pull you out of the pit that you're in. That's what I do. I serve. That is God. That is his nature. And you can't outgive God. And so when he tells us to give, you can't outgive God. In Acts 20:35, it's better to give than to receive. That is true. There are so many passages. I love this one in Luke 6. It says, give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with what measure you use, it will be measured back to you. I was telling someone the other day about my early church attending with my wife after we got married. She wanted to go to church. She was spiritually minded. I didn't want to go to church. I was unspiritually minded. I didn't want to be there. But I remember one day this preacher that later God used to turn my life around. I remember this preacher preaching from Matthew 6:21, which says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." He said, now some people get that reversed. They say where your heart is, you'll put your treasure there, which is actually also true. But Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He said, if you give, if you put your money somewhere, your heart is going to follow the money. He says, so you should give to the church at least a tithe of your income. I actually thought that was crazy. I did not believe it, but I was at the point that I was going to try some of this spiritual stuff I was hearing because my wife wanted it so much in spite of me. And we started giving even at a time, if I recall it correctly, when I didn't even want to be in church. And we started giving a tenth. Wow, that turned things around. It was amazing how that did. And there are just so many times when you give and you know it's more blessed to give than to receive. I remember one time, and not that long ago, when one of our ministry guys was preaching, and he was talking about riches and money and how we viewed it, how we used it, whatever. But he said, no matter what you think about your current financial status compared to the rest of the world, you are rich. And I know that's true. But then somehow in the same context, he showed, pardon me, he showed a film, and it was some little kids in Africa, very, very poor kids in Africa. And somehow the idea of being rich compared to the world and these kids who had zero, nothing, hit me. And I said, you know, I'm going to start giving to those kids. I'm going to find out how to get some money to them. So I called Mark Ottenweller, who worked a lot in Africa with Hope Worldwide, and we had a long conversation. I said, Mark, this video got to me, and the idea that I'm rich compared to the world, I need to do more. And so we talked about it, and he said there's an early childhood development program, and the woman who runs it is fantastic. If you want to give some money, give there. And I said, all right, how do I do it? And so I called Hope up, and I gave him my credit card number, and I said, take $100 a month and give to that. I didn't cut what we're giving to the church every week. This was a different part of my heart involved there, and so I did that. When the whole Ukraine thing came up, I did a ministry in the Ukraine for a number of years, doing teaching and training of ministry people and shepherds and all of that. That got to my heart. And they said, you can give to Hope or the European Mission Society. And so we gave a big chunk to both of those. I know they're both doing slightly different work, but working together. And so we gave to that, and I'm sure we'll give more to that. You just can't outgive God. And so when you do it God's way and you're a servant, it just does something for you. Last week, I looked as I was driving my car. We have a little 2-bedroom cottage near a lake in East Texas. And I was down there by myself having some work done. The place is old and a lot of work always needs to be done. But I was having some work done, but I was going to be doing something else the next morning. And so that afternoon, I decided to drive down to the store and pick up a few things. And I noticed my tire light came on. And I thought, oh no, what a bad time. I've got this early morning appointment, and now I've got a tire problem. I need to do something. And I remembered I got the tires at Discount Tire Store, and I've got a warranty on it. If this thing will make it to that store before closing time, and not go flat on the way, I can get it fixed. So I got to the discount tire store about 15 miles away, and I went in, and there's a guy sitting there. He is a black guy. He's got a shirt on that says, "I served." And so I asked him about his military experience, knowing that's what that meant. And we started talking and talked about a lot of racial issues. We talked about a lot of issues. And he ended up crying much of the time. He's wiping his eyes much of the time. And then he got up, and I knew he was in a really tough place in life right then, but he got up and his tire was ruined. They couldn't fix it. They could fix mine, but they couldn't fix his. And they gave him the price of a tire and what it would cost and all of that. We had formed a bond by then. I'd done a lot of sharing about God and me and all of that. And I walked over and I gave the credit card to the guy working behind the desk there. And I said, "Put it on this card." And the guy that I'd been sharing with was sort of in shock, and some more tears came. And I told him as I left, I gave him a card, and he's got my phone number, and we talked about my websites and a lot of other things. And we'll get together at a future time. But as I walked out, I told him that God brought me there. So I'm glad that tire light was on. That was God helping me to have an abundant life, because it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I could afford to pay for that. And so that $180 charge on my credit card, I could afford that. He couldn't afford that. And so I got to be a giver. And I walked out of there, and I thanked God for a flat tire, and that he allowed me to get 15 miles to get the thing fixed. But that's just God. He's always serving, and he's always training us to serve. And when we serve, we'll have an abundant life. There is no way around it. Well, we have Judy Mosley back with us again today. Thank you for being back.
Thanks for having me.
I enjoyed having your husband on 2 times, and now you for the second time.
How'd he do?
He did well.
Good.
Yeah,
good.
you've trained him well.
That's awesome.
So the bottom line to this lesson, this starts a little bit of a short series within a series, but this lesson about servanthood is, since God is a servant and he calls us to imitate him, and the greatest of all is a servant and the slave, what are the fruits of servanthood? How does that show up in our life, and how is it a blessing in our life? Mm. And if we have the umbrella of servanthood over our lives and all that we're trying to do, then it makes everything fall into place, and it makes us look at certain things, I think, in a different way. Mm-hmm. So today we're talking about the abundant life that Jesus did promise. So in John 10, he talks about us having that life to the full and abundant life, depending on the version. So as you heard that lesson, what are the questions that came to mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, I really love how you describe this big umbrella that's mm-hmm. over us, because I do think that if we start there, mm-hmm. and then it helps us to realize that God truly, that there is a love, this love that God wants to cover us mm-hmm. with. Mm-hmm. But what we run into is the deception that Satan wants to put in our minds and in mm-hmm. our hearts. So mm-hmm. as I listen to what you were saying, I think the thief does come to kill, steal, mm-hmm. and destroy, right? And mm-hmm. and so the reality is that as the humanity really wrestles with believing God. Mm-hmm. So my first question to you was, how did you get to that place where you just truly believed God, that he wants good for you, right? Because mm-hmm. I think we wrestle with that. Even mm-hmm. though we are disciples of Jesus, I think there's still times in our lives where we wrestle to believe. Mm-hmm. So how do you work through that?
Well, I'm not the expert on any of this. Mm-hmm. I'm a participant in the game of life along with everybody else. Mm-hmm. I think with age comes certain things. I can look at a lot of years and look at what God has done in my life and look at the times that I didn't like and I thought he was doing the wrong thing. And I realized, wow, that worked really well. And he did the right thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's a learned process of trust that God is going to serve and love and bless us, but maybe not in the ways that we think, but we have to have a changed perspective. Even like the passages that I shared, self-denial and hate your family and give up your life and take up your cross daily and all of that. Well, if you just look at that from a worldly standpoint, who would sign up for that?
Right.
Who would get on that bus?
Yeah.
But then if you look at how that actually works, denying self, how that actually works rather than self-indulgence, self-denial, serving others. When you look at how all of that works, then you just develop more and more trust in God's approach to life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's it. It's just experience and belief in the Bible together put into practice. And you just see, in essence, it works.
Yeah.
And you quit questioning nearly as much. But there are always those times when we question.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And God is patient. It's what servants have to be.
Yeah.
Servants are patient.
That's true. That's a good point. I think the comparison of what you maybe in your past had versus what God is trying to offer can help a lot with the perspective too. Because I think that's ultimately, even as when I became a disciple almost 20 years ago, like that was the thing. I didn't want what I had. And I knew, where else do I go? Right. Like Peter,
right.
Where else? Like this is it. And it is hard. There's moments of doubt, but I think this is better than what I had.
Right.
And so I appreciate you. Just that is a great way, a great perspective to always keep in mind. So I loved what you shared about, that God loves us and wants us to be full of joy. We talked about belief. So one of the thoughts, believing and trusting intentions helps us produce right motivation. That takes us cultivating consistent relationships. So to follow Jesus, like what you were saying, we must practice self-denial, daily cross-bearing, and loss of life. Without understanding that, we can tend to, what you were saying earlier, embrace the wrong narrative of God. So we begin to think that he's more of a demanding God and unreasonable God versus really trusting his motive and his intention, because there isn't a relationship, right? And so do you think humanity's biggest obstacle is trusting that God's way is the best way, or overcoming our sinful nature?
Well, those two go together. They go together. You won't deny your sinful nature until you trust that God's way is right. So they're built all together there, but the tendency is to want to go back to something from the past that we did. The temptation is there, and so that's when the self-denial comes in. And yet, every time I give in to selfishness, when the Bible talks about denying self, some people say, well, that's impossible and that's wrong and self should be cared for, etc. When he says deny self, he's talking about our selfish self, the worldly self.
Right.
He's not talking about the self that's made in the image of God. That's a whole different identity there. He's talking about the selfish self, the worldly nature that we have. Deny that, because it's going to lead you down the wrong path. So he's not saying get rid of self. He actually wants to cultivate the self that is made in his image. And that's why he says deny the other one. It's kind of like you got the devil on one side and the angel on the other side, and they're both working on you, trying to get you in their fold.
Right.
But saying no to this side and yes to this one puts you in the place to find out that self-denial is a good thing. And my grandmother illustration, I think, is helpful with that because I got to see that one up close and personal, and how selfishness and lack of selfishness made such a dramatic contrast between two grandmothers, both of whom I loved,
Yeah.
but one I wanted to be around all the time, and the
Mhm.
other one sometimes not so much.
Was there a reason why one was more than the other? One had more boundaries, or one
No, one
just
was self-focused and often down in the dumps, and the other one was always happy and giving and serving.
mm, played a big difference?
Yeah.
Okay. I really loved how you shared that God truly does want to cultivate the image bearer side of us, that He created us, and to help us recognize that the sinful side, the selfish side, it's the stuff that's not helping us,
Right.
right? So what in a world where we are busy and getting busier by the minute,
Right.
what would you say to someone who just really struggles with being in God's presence and seeing the value in reading God's word to help them cultivate those areas that God needs them to?
Well, I try to help them look at life. That's one advantage of being old,
Hmm.
is I can tell people, hey, this is not guesswork with me. There's no theory involved here. I have watched people's lives, people that I know well, that I love. When I was young, uh, I didn't want to do it the right way. I wanted to do it my way. I wanted my selfishness to win, and it did. And so I would hear from my mother, especially, this path is going to end up bad. And I was thinking, it doesn't look so bad to me. I can look at these people that I know and relatives and whomever else, and it looks like they're getting by with it, bottom line. But you run enough years off that clock and you see the devastation
Yeah.
that, is obvious. So when I share with people that are younger, I can just tell them, hey, Doc, you're looking into all this, and right now it's theory and guesswork. With me, it's not theory and it's not guesswork.
Mm.
I have seen it.
Been there, done that.
Been there, done that, but then I can give examples. And so I go through people and lives and what has happened to them. And no one would have believed how bad it was going to turn out.
Right.
No one would have believed it in a lot of cases that I'm thinking about and know about. So I just try to use my years of experience to say, a part of this is take a look. And I think that's why the Bible gives examples, good and bad, of even people in the Old Testament. Is you see, okay, here's where this leads.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you do it this way, here's where this leads. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that we can offer to people is just, here's life, here are examples.
Yeah.
Here's what I've seen.
I think that's powerful, especially as you think about the importance of the older generation really seeing the value in sharing those experiences, because we need them as young bucks. We
Right.
need to hear from you guys, and vice versa.
Mhm.
The younger need to be able to share their thoughts as well. But there is so much value in the experiences that you guys have had, and so we definitely appreciate you guys when you do share them with us, because we
Yeah.
need them.
Well, I think the challenge as a young person is to want to listen and to want to hear.
Good point.
And I think in our current society, it's probably worse than it's ever been. Social media has contributed to it,
Oh, yeah.
but people think they know everything. Everybody is an expert about everything just because they can blab their opinion
On
on
YouTube.
some social media type thing.
Yep.
And the truth is, they haven't seen enough life to be able to know what they're talking about in some areas, because they're only going to get it either by their experience the hard way or by taking somebody else's experience the good way and listening to it.
Mm.
And that's the whole book of Proverbs. It's designed to teach you the practical things of life, the older teaching the younger, the fathers teaching the sons especially, but the daughters as well, teaching them, okay, here's what works in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some young people that really listen to that. And I talk to a lot of young people, and they all try to sound respectful, but I can tell the ones that are really listening or not.
Yeah.
I've dealt with people way too long. And I can tell when they are just wanting to go back and tell their friends, well, at least I talked to him. I think he's all up in the woods, as far as understanding life and society as it is.
Right.
So they act polite when they're talking with you, but there's some actually listening.
Mm-hmm.
But that's true of adults too.
True.
We listen or we don't listen.
Mm-hmm.
We think we're smarter than we are, or we realize, hey, we don't have all the answers. We've already made enough mistakes. So we ought to start listening better.
Yeah.
And with a multitude of counselors, Proverbs said, that's how you make the right decisions.
Mm.
And so it's not just a young person's problem. Older people don't listen either, many of them. And we have to decide, do we think we know it all, or are we willing to listen? So anyway, I'm going to cut us off at this point, but I appreciate you coming back and being on with us a second time. And I enjoyed your questions and observation, which I want this to be. I don't have all the answers, so I appreciate other people sharing as they ask questions, being able to share perspectives that I might not share. So it's been very helpful.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks to you.
Mm-hmm.